Homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today we are making canned baked beans, so pressure canned baked beans in the kitchen. And this was inspired by going through all of my seed stashes. I do an inventory of all of my seeds at the beginning of every year, deciding what I need to retire that's probably too old, what I can throw into a seed swap that I don't want to grow anymore but is still good, and what I need to buy in terms of new stock for the current year. And I was going through and I realized I had a whole bunch of beans that I'm kind of obsessed with dried beans. And if you followed me for any length of time, you know that. And I had some beans that didn't germinate this last year in 2024 when I was trying to grow them out. So I had a couple of batches of beans that I knew were past their prime in terms of germination. And then as I was going through and looking at all the other stuff, I tend to keep probably a half a cup to a cup of dried beans of the particular variety just as a seed source. And then I grow those out like once every 3 or 4 years to keep the seed fresh. And I realized I had quite a bit of stuff that I had grown out, and so I had fresher seed and it was just leftover old seed. And so I ended up just deciding, okay, I'm just going to cook all of these and pressure can them, because even when beans are really old, if you pressure can them, they will get all the way cooked. Sometimes when your beans are really old and you're just cooking them on the stove, they will stay chalky and just never soften up. So if you've ever cooked beans and had that happen and thought you were doing something wrong, or thought it was because you added salt, it wasn't that. It was that the beans were super old. Although interestingly, Rose Red Homestead, who I follow on YouTube, just did a really interesting post where she cooked beans that were over 20 years old, and she added a little bit of baking powder to the soaking water, and that alkali quality of the baking powder allows the beans to absorb liquid better. And so even though the beans were 20 years old, they did cook up quite well because of the baking powder. So that's an interesting tip that I had not really put together. But anyway, I ended up with all of these beans and I thought I'm just gonna pressure cook them. And I had just done some pressure canned beans that were plain. I didn't really need any more of those. And we like a baked bean, especially when we're camping. It's a really great, easy, quick meal to have as a side. But every time I've looked at baked bean recipes and the few times that I've made baked bean recipes, it's always been really unclear which was the better recipe. There's a whole variety of different ones out there. And then some of them are pretty tomato or ketchup heavy. Some of them are more molasses and brown sugar heavy. And so which way did I want to go? Which beans did I like better? And I just decided, since I had all these extra beans, I'm just going to make them all. And so I cut down the recipes to about 4 pints a piece. And I made 4 different batches of beans. And then I ended up with an additional 5th batch that was actually just a combination of a bunch of different stuff that I had left over from the first 4 batches. And I have some thoughts. What I haven't done is opened each individual pint of beans and tasted it for taste testing. I think I have a pretty clear winner regardless of that, which is the one that has the most sweetening and the most bacon in it, because that's going to taste kind of like Bush's baked beans, which tends to be our preference. Unfortunately, it's just my husband and I, so it's only 2 people, and we really don't need what would be the equivalent of 2 quarts of baked beans all at once. And so I haven't done a taste test. When we do that, I will bring you along for that. And so we will have a follow-up video where we do a taste test of each of the different beans and give our impressions and our thoughts, probably when we're getting ready to do like a 4th of July celebration, and I can do a whole bunch of baked beans at once to feed a bunch of people. So unfortunately, if you're in this for the taste test, which when I posted this on a canning group and I was asking some questions about whether or not it's important to bake your beans before you can them or not, 0 people answered that question. Nobody even registered that it was a question, but I had like 100 people want to know what the taste test results were. So I don't have that information for you yet, but I do have some very clear thoughts on all of these different recipes, what they have in common, why they vary the way they do, and what kind of leeway you might have on a personal level to tweak the recipe to your liking, which I think is a lot more latitude than they will initially let you think you have, because all 4 of these recipes, even though they are radically different in terms of how they're put together and what they contain, have a 65-minute processing time for pints. So anyway, let's get started. I'll have some spreadsheets up that will show you some comparisons between the different recipes and some thoughts. And hopefully this will inspire you to not feel intimidated by making baked bean recipes out of some of your beans in your own pantry. Let's get started.
So as I mentioned, this is a really random mix
of a bunch of different old beans, including one called Loft House, which is a mix of beans in and of itself. They are really gorgeous, but some of these are 3 or 4 years old for sure. This is the night before. I'm doing a pre-soak, and so filtered water. I may have put a pinch of baking soda in there. I can't remember. And then I'm just soaking those overnight. So here's the next morning. Everything has fully hydrated, and we are ready to start with our bean experiments. And I decided that each recipe would have 4 cups of rehydrated beans in it to start. The first 2 I'm going to do are the ones that are baked. I've never done a canned baked bean recipe before where you actually bake the beans because it's always seemed really fiddly to me. So I thought I'd start with those. This first recipe is from the National Center for Home Food Preservation, and I resized this to 4 cups, but I have some thoughts on this. The way this recipe is originally written gives you information that 5 pounds of beans are needed for a canner load, and then it goes in down below to making up your sauce. It does not actually indicate that your sauce is for 5 pounds of beans, and a lot of people assume that's the case. I did assume that, and I cut the recipe down to equal only 4 cups of beans, but my guess is the way this is supposed to be interpreted is you mix up enough sauce for the amount of beans that you actually have on hand, and you just keep making batches of sauce until you have enough for all of your beans. So I don't think it's supposed to be as dilute as what I made it. There's a lot of debate on that, and I did send a question to the National Center for Home Food Preservation specifically about that, asking them to clarify the directions there, because adding just a tiny little bit of molasses and vinegar and salt and mustard to this, you're going to end up with beans that are just barely flavored. But here's that first recipe. It does have a little bit of pork in it, just a tiny bit, about 1 inch. And I'm using bacon in all cases here, even if the recipe calls for salt pork. Here's the second baked bean recipe. This one is from Bernardin and radically different in size. So 8 ounces of salt pork instead of a tiny little 1 inch of salt pork or bacon, and then 3 cups of onions. So a huge amount of onions, and then 2/3 of a cup of molasses, 2/3 of a cup of brown sugar. In my case, I'm using a white sugar and then adding just a touch of extra molasses because I didn't actually have any brown sugar in the house. And then quite a bit of mustard and some salt. Very few of these recipes have a lot of salt. I'm not quite sure why. This one's interesting. It has the salt and the bacon, so we're going to get extra saltiness from the bacon. And then you top that off, stir it up, and cook it in your oven at 350 until the beans are fully cooked. And so here's both batches of the ones that are getting baked at different times. The one on the left was 4 to 5 hours. The one on the right was 3 to 3.5 hours. I have no idea why they would be so radically different. About an hour in, I gave everything a stir and just double checked to make sure the liquid levels hadn't fallen. This Corning ware I have has a much tighter lid than this old Pyrex. And so I definitely needed to top up the liquid on the Pyrex. I think a lot more is escaping because that lid is not nearly as tight. But while those were cooking, I started on the other 2 batches I decided to make. One of them is without baking, a healthy canning recipe. And this was adapted from one of the National Center for Home Food Preservation recipes. And then they just tweaked it to make it what they wanted it to be and a little bit more like an actual baked bean recipe. You par cook the beans for 2 minutes in some water with some bay leaf in it, and then you make the sauce separately while your beans are par cooking. It's interesting that it's only 2 minutes. If you ever can beans plain, they have you par cook them for 30 minutes, and they claim that it's only 2 minutes because you don't want the beans to get excessively cooked and soggy. So that in and of itself is interesting, but putting together the sauce that goes into this, and then you strain off your cooked beans that have only been cooking for 2 minutes. I'm sure that bay leaf didn't have a lot of chance to do much. You're going to want to reserve 3 cups of that bean liquid to go into your sauce. And so here I'm just measuring off all but 3 cups. So here we've got our 3 cups, and I'm going to stir that in to my sauce mixture, give that a stir, and then I'm gonna heat it up in the microwave so that it is piping hot when I'm adding it to my beans. And because this is homemade tomato paste, it's gonna take a little stirring to get that to break down fully. So I'm distributing my beans between my 3 jars. In general, when you're canning beans, if you don't go all the way up to that 1-inch line, you're gonna have a better product. If you go all the way up to the 1-inch headspace line with your beans, they release a lot of starch. And while they're safe to eat, they are very hard to get out of the jar because that starch just basically makes everything into one solid mass. And so it's helpful if you go about 2/3 of the way full instead of all the way full. So here's our beans. And I specifically was keeping track of jars at this point, but then I decided to just mark the lids with a Sharpie before I put them in the canner so that I would be able to tell them apart. Here's our piping hot liquid tomato-based sauce that's going on these with all of that onion and all of brown sugar. And I like to distribute kind of evenly across and then go back. A lot of stuff is on the surface, and so I'm getting initially a lot of stuff that's floating, and then the second round I get a lot of stuff that's sinking. So just to kind of make sure that I've got a nice even distribution. This was one of the recipes where I had quite a bit of extra sauce left over once I got these 3 jars done. And I'm not going to show you this process on every single recipe, but I will show you on this one. So giving everything a little bit of a twist, a little bit of a tap, just to knock any air bubbles out of there. And then I'm filling this to 1-inch headspace. So topping these off the rest of the way. You see I've got quite a bit of sauce left over there. And I did use that for something else later. And then wiping your rims really well. This is just for people that are new to this. I'm not going to show you this 4 times, but it's always good to see it once. Put new lids on, put your rings on, and then you're going to tighten a little bit more than you normally would. They're going to be under a lot of pressure in that canner. They're going to be releasing a lot of air. A tighter lid generally leads to a better product and a better seal. Okay, so here's our beans after they've been cooking for 3 hours, and these are pretty much done. And then here's our second batch. And these, I think I went back and let these cook a little bit longer. They weren't quite finished, and that probably had to do with the amount of acid that was in the mix. If you add a lot of acid to your beans, they tend to firm up and not cook quite as fast. So the first canner load is the National Center for Home Food Preservation baked recipe and the Healthy Canning not baked recipe. So here they are out of the canner, batch number 1 and batch number 3. So 1 batch was baked, 1 batch was not baked. I don't really know what the baking is supposed to add to this process. And honestly, I find it really fiddly and I probably won't do it again. I think it's unnecessary. I think they bake in the can. That's the point. Here's recipe number 4. So this was another, just put it directly into the can. And this is very similar to that first National Center for Home Food Preservation. Same issue with cutting the recipe down. Is it supposed to be for 5 full pounds of beans? Or is it supposed to be enough sauce with 3 cups of liquid and then your cup of tomato sauce? I cut it down, but I think it probably could have been easily way more flavored. And then here's our second batch of baked beans going in as well. And then I combined stuff to do the leftovers for that 5th batch of canning. So here's everything out of the canner and finished up. And you will see the jars are still bubbling, the ones that recently came out of the canner. That is completely normal. Don't be alarmed by that. All right, so here are all of our baked beans. I ended up with 15 jars, 3 jars each of the test versions. So this one is the Healthy Canning recipe. It's got onion and Worcestershire sauce and lots of other seasonings. And it's a little bit sweet. It's got a little bit of brown sugar in it, but not super, super sweet. Nice recipe. You can see in terms of siphoning, quite a bit of siphoning on this, but everything is in good shape. I had all the jars seal, so we've taken the rings off and washed the jars at this point, and I can pick up the jars by the rims, which is a good indication that the seal is really solid. This is National Center for Home Food Preservation, and this is their baked bean recipe. So this actually gets baked in the oven and then put into the jar. And this one is really simple. It has some molasses, a little bit of vinegar, salt, dry mustard. So that's it. No bacon in this, no onion in this. And this was the most liquid and the least siphoning of all of the recipes. That's just a black bean in there. So this is a mixed bunch of colored beans. But you can see I've got the most liquid of any of these. And even so, you know, the fill line was to the bottom of this rim. And you can see that I've still had siphoning. So beans just siphon, it's what happens. They're in the canner for 65 minutes. And the density of the beans, you're gonna get some siphoning regardless. But you can see, actually this one is, yeah, they're pretty good. They did not siphon a lot. So this is the least siphoning of everything that I did. This one is the Bernardin recipe from out of Canada. So this is basically identical to the one in the All New Ball cooking book. It's just the Canadian one that's available online. And this is probably the most complicated of all of them. And this also has the most bacon. So this has got a lot of bacon, a lot of onions. So this is probably the closest to what you would typically find if you wanted something that was along the lines of a Bush's beans or any kind of traditional off-the-shelf kind of sweet bean. This has a lot of sugar in it. So this has got molasses and brown sugar as well. So this is probably the most complex of the recipes and the one I'm most looking forward to eating because it does have a lot of bacon in there. You can see on some of these, this one I think is a little more obvious. You can see some grease in there or some fat that's been released from the bacon. That should not be an issue as long as we eat them fairly quickly. This one is National Center for Home Food Preservation, and this one is made with ketchup. They have 3 different recipes on their site. One is made with a tomato sauce and then a bunch of spices. One is made with just ketchup, and then one is the molasses sauce. The molasses sauce recipe is identical to this recipe. And so this is basically the exact same recipe. It's just that this one is actually baked in the oven and then canned. And this one, if you made it with the molasses, just goes straight into the jars and isn't baked, which raises the question, what is the point of the baking? How does that change the flavor? I don't have a good answer for that. If you guys have a good answer for that, please put a comment below. I'm curious about that. But the one with the tomato sauce rather than the ketchup, essentially what they were doing was making ketchup because it was spices that would typically be found in ketchup. I've made homemade ketchup before. And so I just opted to use the recipe that was just ketchup rather than the one that started with like a tomato juice and then a bunch of spices and things. Not a lot of ketchup. So 3 jars, quarter cup of ketchup between all 3 jars. These recipes from the National Center for Home Food Preservation, very, very light on the seasonings. All of these were the exact same processing time. They were all 65 minutes, which to me indicates that these being so light on the seasonings is just how they were tested and not necessarily for safety and density, because like this one, the Bernardin site, there's a lot of stuff going on in here, including bacon. This one has just over a tablespoon of ketchup per jar and nothing else except water. So very different densities in terms of the sauce going into this, and yet same processing time. So I think that gives you quite a bit of leeway. I'm going to assume that this is going to be more like the typical beans and tomatoes sauce that is popular in the UK. So Heinz makes a beans tomato sauce recipe, and I'm assuming this is going to be similar to that. Their recipe for the molasses one, again, is the same as the baked one, just not baked. And then this was, I had some sauce left over, and I had a little bit of the beans left over from one of the other recipes that didn't quite fit in the jar, the one with all the bacon in it. And so I just used the rest of the beans that I had, and this is a mix. On the bottom is the beans from the bacon recipe, so the baked beans, there was a little bit left because it was a big recipe because of all the other stuff that was in it. And then I had a lot of the tomato sauce recipe from this recipe. I had a lot of tomato sauce left over from the healthy canning recipe, which was tomato sauce with onions in it. And so I opted to use that along with the miscellaneous other beans to fill these jars and then just top them off with water. So this is a mix just in order to use up all of the beans that I had on hand. But I'm excited to try these. I think it's going to be a really fun experiment. The ones with the asterisks are the ones that have bacon and more sugar and are more traditionally like a typical baked bean recipe that you would buy at the store. So I have those asterisked because my husband's not going to know the difference unless I tell him. And then these ones with just ketchup or that were a pretty light sauce, I'm going to assume that I could also use these not only as baked beans, but just throw them into chili or other recipes that I need beans that with a little bit of flavor. So there you have it, 15 jars of various versions of baked canned beans. Hopefully this helps clarify, I think, some of the mystery around this. I personally do not think that the density by adding things like onion or adding a little bit of bacon is really critical to safety, as every one of these recipes has the same processing time. And it does help to not pack the jars super full. These ones are the fullest of the bunch because I was trying to use up everything I had left. And so these I did have the beans come all the way up to the 1-inch processing line. The rest of these I tried to leave it a little bit low. I think it helps with siphoning, and it helps with them not just being such a giant wad of starch in the jar when you're trying to get it out. And so all of the rest of these, they were filled not all the way up to the 1-inch processing line with the beans themselves. I tried to go to about here and then do the rest with liquid, which I think helps a little bit with some of the other processing issues. You saw that I tightened the lids down pretty darn tight. I have found that with a 65-minute processing time with beans, you sometimes end up with bad seals if the lids aren't tighter than you would normally think with finger tight. So a little bit extra there. So if I were to recommend one recipe just simply based on what I think is going to be like super tasty, it would either be this recipe from Healthy Canning, or it would be the one from Bernardin out of Canada, which is also similar to the one in the New Ball cookbook. I think these are going to be the most like the baked beans that you're used to finding in the store. Hey tribe, if you've made it this far, I just wanted to let you know this video was a bear to edit. It probably took me a total of about 8 hours of editing, not to mention filming. And so if you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment, and share. It really makes a huge difference. And we'll see you on the next one. I have new content coming out every week.